Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. As Donald Trump prepares to take office in January 2025, his foreign policy agenda faces immediate tests from a complex and volatile global landscape. With Russia's war in Ukraine, China's assertiveness over Taiwan, and heightened tensions in the Middle East, the world is looking to see how Trump will deliver on his campaign promises. How will his rhetoric translate into action? Joining us today on TVP World to discuss this transition is Peter Dickinson, the UkraineAlert Editor at the Atlantic Council. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Hello.
So Trump has promised a lot during his presidential campaign, especially when it comes to resolving international conflicts really quickly. What are some of the key challenges that you think will come in his way? What are some of the speed bumps and roadblocks?
Well, I think Trump has been quite clear throughout his campaign and now during the transition that his foreign policy priority is ending the war in Ukraine, is ending the Russian invasion of Ukraine, ending at least the hot phase of the conflict. That's been the message from Trump himself and from those close to him. So that's clearly going to be number one on his foreign policy agenda. Now, of course, that's very well known, and the Russians know that too. So his big challenge, I think, or the biggest challenge in terms of trying to achieve that is going to be how can he convince the Russians to come to the negotiating table and agree on terms that are acceptable, obviously, to Ukraine itself, but also to America, when America is signaling that it's very much in need of a deal. Trump knows that if he wants to make a deal, he has to do so from a position of strength. And the one thing he can't afford to do is look like he's desperate and hand too much of the initiative in negotiations to Russia. So I think the immediate challenge he'll have to face and the task he'll have to face is that he needs to convince the Russians that they need to take these negotiations seriously. And if they don't, the consequences for Moscow will be very negative.
Right, like you mentioned, this move of trying to get two countries to a negotiation table is perhaps telegraphed a mile away. Do you think that in this kind of demonstration of eagerness to come to a negotiation will probably put Ukraine at a more disadvantageous position when it comes to negotiating?
Well, absolutely, that is the big concern. Russia at the moment is in a strong position. Russian troops are advancing in eastern Ukraine. They are not making major advances, but nevertheless, they've been slowly but steadily moving forward, gaining new ground, occupying new territory for some months now. So they clearly hold the battlefield initiative. Ukraine has well-publicized issues with equipment and with manpower. Its army is suffering from shortages in both those categories. Ukraine's allies are showing signs of fatigue. So from a Russian point of view, the situation looks fairly advantageous. There's no obvious reason why Russia should rush into negotiations. Now, if you add to that mix this idea that Trump has said, I'm going to solve it, I can do it in 24 hours, this kind of rhetoric, he's clearly put himself out there. He's clearly staked his reputation on his ability to end this war. From a Russian point of view, that puts them in a very strong negotiating position. They're winning the war. All the circumstances appear to be in their favor, and now they have an American president taking office and basically saying, "I will end this war," and staking his reputation on that. So. It's going to require some quite strong positioning from America to somehow shift that negotiating position and as I say, convince the Russians that actually time is not on their side and they really do need to take these talks seriously.
Right, so it really kind of, we'll have to see how the U.S. administration continue to navigate throughout all these dynamics. Meanwhile, we are looking also at the situation with China as, well, China and Russia have been kind of deepening ties. Some are suggesting that Trump could employ a sort of a divide-conquer strategy, but do you think that in and of itself is feasible?
Well, honestly, I don't see the Chinese being in any hurry either here to help out Trump. I think from the Chinese perspective, the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is a conflict against the West. Now, I don't think that the Chinese were particularly thrilled about Putin's decision to launch this war, but now that he's done that, now the war is already escalating and it's about to enter its fourth year. The one thing the Chinese don't want to see is a Russian defeat. They are very keen to make sure that Russia remains a major player because Russia is one of China's key allies, key partners. Also, China is looking to establish itself as a major global player. China has offered a number of peace initiatives. They haven't at this stage made any real progress in that direction, but clearly they're looking to say, we're a major global player. We have a role to play in any major global events. Now, the Russian war in Ukraine is clearly the major global event at the moment. So China will want to play a role, but they won't want to play second fiddle to the Americans. Now, at the moment, what we're talking about is Trump coming into the White House. This is very much the Trump show, the America show. China, I think, will be very reluctant to get on board there and be seen to be playing a secondary role in what would be an American peace initiative. China would much rather launch their own initiative, maybe work with other countries in the so-called global south, work with perhaps the Brazilians, we've seen that developing, work with countries in the Middle East, look to have a new approach to this issue that sets them apart from the West. So I don't know if Trump's going to make that play with the Chinese, but I don't see the Chinese being particularly interested in playing that role and being cooperative with Trump at this stage. I think on the contrary, they'd look to try and distance themselves and show that America is no longer the global authority.
What about the U.S. relationship with NATO? We do know that Trump is pressuring NATO to spend a lot more on defense. Can we take a step back and see it as sort of a piece of a bigger puzzle where perhaps the strengthening of NATO is something that would put perhaps Ukraine or the collective West on a stronger footing to go into this peace negotiation?
Well, Trump has been talking about NATO and Europe in general's lack of spending, of their insufficient defence spending, going back even to the Cold War. During the 1980s, Trump very famously went to Moscow at the invitation of the Soviets, and when he returned to America, he took out a number of very large full-page advertisements in America's leading newspapers, specifically saying that America was basically paying for Europe's defence, and Europe was getting a free ride, and Europe should pay more. So this is a very long-standing position, perhaps the longest-standing of all Trump's political positions, certainly in the foreign policy sphere. Since he first ran for the presidency in 2015, again, it's been a constant feature of his rhetoric. When he was the president, he pushed NATO members in Europe to spend more. So certainly, I think it's safe to assume that's going to be a key aspect of his presidency, of his relationship with NATO. There have been some signals recently that he's trying to step back a little bit from his earlier rhetoric, this idea that he would let countries that didn't pay their full way be invaded by Russia. I think he's stepping back a little bit from that, but certainly he's going to push all of the NATO countries to significantly increase their defence spending. He'll look for a lot of that defence spending to come to American defence companies, of course. That's one of the advantages for America of increased defence spending in NATO, that American businesses earn money from that. And that would overall have the impact of strengthening Ukraine's position. But it's not going to come overnight. I mean, that's something that we would see in 1 year, in 2 years. So from a Ukrainian point of view, probably that won't have a huge impact, certainly not in the short term.
And on the topic of Trump and the, international allies, we do see the administration considering significant tariff increases. Of course, a lot of people are arguing that is sort of a leverage tool and something to kind of bring their allies to agree on some terms that Trump wanted to see. But how do you think that plays with the global economy as well as kind of U.S. foreign relationship?
Well, I mean, economic relations are at the heart of the transatlantic relationship. Of course, that's always been a security relationship as well. But fundamentally, I think now for most governments, certainly in the short term, it's an economic relationship. And if Trump goes down that road, if he pressures the nations of Europe using tariffs or other tools, and there is some kind of a trade war or confrontation, that's going to create a lot of divisions within the Western camp. Now, this is a time where unity is absolutely critical for the West. That's been one of the strong points of the Biden administration, although that's sometimes meant they've gone slower in terms of their support for Ukraine than certainly Ukrainians would have liked to have seen. But they have maintained a degree of unity there. Trump's sort of bull in the China shop approach, his very confrontational approach, might undermine that unity, and that could create tensions in the security sphere as well as the economic sphere that we would, obviously for Ukraine, there would be negative ramifications, but also for the wider European community, certainly.
All right, last but not least, since we're leaving 2024 behind us, looking forward to next year, 2025, what foreign policy positions do you think will define Trump's next term as well as U.S. leadership going forward?
Well, I think that the Ukraine war will remain at the heart of international relations, and in many ways, the way that this war is resolved, if it is resolved, will define or will certainly shape international relations throughout the Trump presidency and beyond. So it remains the key. Trump's great task, I think, now, if he wishes to really end this war, certainly he'll need to gain leverage in terms of negotiations with Russia. That means showing a willingness to strengthen Ukraine's position militarily, and also showing a willingness to create leverage in other areas with Russia, particularly in the energy sphere. Now, of course, Trump is known for his enthusiasm for drilling, his enthusiasm for boosting the American domestic energy sector output. That could bring down the price of oil globally. So he's got tools he can use, but he needs to use them. He needs to use them to demonstrate to the Russians that he means business and that it's in their interest to settle. But I think as the leader of America, so as the de facto leader of the free world, of the democratic world, he must also lead in efforts to create some sort of long-term security for Ukraine. Unless Ukraine has security, then any sort of peace deal or ceasefire will really likely be just a pause before Russia resumes the war at an opportune time once it's had an opportunity to rearm, to learn the lessons of this first phase and to go further. So the real challenge will be, if we're talking about a long-term peace, it has to come via some sort of security guarantees, and they really can only come from America, with other countries then joining in. That might not mean NATO membership. Frankly, NATO membership looks unlikely at this stage, but it needs to be a very serious commitment from the US and other Western countries to Ukraine's long-term security. If that happens, and if Ukraine is secured, then I think the outcome of the war looks quite positive for the West and quite positive for the idea of international stability and international law. If we go down the other road and Ukraine is left basically isolated in no man's land, waiting for the next Russian attack, then we're looking at a long-term period of instability globally, and that will have a big impact on the situation for Europe and for America.
All right, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you.
Cheers. And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.